representative of Alaskans all the way from Kodiak to Anchorage. It was called a Panorama of Terror. And we've had so many requests here at Heart Radio to rebroadcast it for persons at home that are going to be tape recording it. And once again, we present Panorama of Terror. Now settles after the most violent earthquake ever recorded in the Northern Hemisphere, and the full picture of its enormity begins to emerge. Now KHAR weaves together some details of the panoramic convulsion and its path of human terror. That afternoon, Louis Beatty noticed something strange. His 200 head of cattle were grazing quietly at his ranch on Narrow Cape, a lovely finger of land washed by the Gulf of Alaska, about 50 miles southeast of Kodiak Town on the Gulf of Kodiak. About 3 o'clock that afternoon, the cattle turned and began to move away from their low-lying grazing land to higher ground. They had never done this before, so early in the day. Louis Beatty frowned. The sky was sunny and blue. The mountains behind him stood serenely in their skirts of snow. The wind blowing in from the turquoise sea was gentle. Beatty sensed that the cattle had sensed something. But what? What indeed? The mood of Alaska on this Good Friday, March 27th, 1964, was benign. Spring was coming. The temperature was rising. People were already betting on when the ice would break up in the rivers. Even in this age of flight, the ice breakup remained symbolic to Alaskans. The winter feeling of isolation was about to yield to the friendliness of spring, like opening a window onto the outside, onto the rest of the United States, deep down under the Earth's crust, more than 50 miles down. In an eternal darkness without season, it is thought that a huge river of slowly swirling, boiling, pitch-like substance rings the great iron core of the Earth. Just what was happening down there on this Good Friday, no man on Earth could say with certainty, and cows make unreliable seismologists. One theory is that this huge river, by its constant and opposing currents, wears and strains the Earth's crust. Where the crust is weak, it may crack. Alaska is known to lie on a relatively weak layer of crust. At her tiny frame home in Anchorage, Joan Groom couldn't have cared less about the mysterious forces grinding and straining the earth beneath. Of more immediate concern were the visible forces that could at any moment wreck her living room and nervous system. The children at last were in their places. The pink cake with its cover of coconut was on the table. Her daughter, Claudia, had made her wish and was now ready to blow out the 4 pink candles. 10 young critics, 4 of them her brothers and sisters, were yelling that she couldn't do it in one puff. Downtown, Harry Groom, a photographer, was starting home. Recalling his daughter's party, he decided on one quick fortification against the inevitable chaos. He pulled up at the Highland Fling, where they sell 2 drinks for the price of 1 between 5 and 6 o'clock, went inside and ordered bourbon. Out in the quiet suburb called Turnagain by the sea, a well-birched subdivision of ranch and split-level homes, Esther McCready was finishing a ham with brown sugar and pineapple rings. Her husband was due home for supper in about 20 minutes. Far to the south across the alabaster peaks and sparkling sea, 250 miles from Claudia Groom's birthday party, and 50 miles northwest of Louis Beatty's curiously acting cattle, Bill Cuthbert, a leathery and grizzled fisherman, was sitting down to supper in the galley of his 86-foot scow, the Salif. The boat was tied to its slip in Kodiak Harbor, a picturesque horseshoe at the foot of the mountains. In the hold were $3,000 worth of Alaska king crabs, ready to be unloaded next morning at the cannery. Atop the hill above the harbor, in the sanctuary of St. James, the Episcopal Church, Carpenter Lewis Horn was hanging a new cross above the altar. It was now 5:20 p.m. Horn selected 2 small eye bolts to suspend the heavy cross from the ceiling. "Do you think these will hold it, Lewis?" asked the Reverend Donald Bullock. "Oh, sure, Father." "Oh, what if we have an earthquake?" the father chuckled. "Even in an earthquake," laughed the carpenter. By Alaska standards, it was warm, about 35 degrees in Kodiak and Anchorage, and the infrequent towns and remote villages in between. But 1,500 miles down the rim of the Great Pacific Basin at Newport, Oregon, it was much warmer, and Monty and Rita McKenzie and their 4 children had gone to the shore on a camping trip. They found a cozy spot for the night, a driftwood shelter on the beach north of Newport. The sea glowed in the light of a full moon. The McKenzie family, clustered tightly together, soon fell asleep. After 7 months, the pain of their 9-year-old daughter's death had begun to ebb. And in the serenity that bathed the moonlit beach in Oregon, the gentle harbor in Kodiak, and the quiet going-home time in Anchorage, the earth crust under Alaska could no longer endure the strains of the inexorable forces below. It let go at 5:36 p.m. Anchorage time. And across more than 600 miles of mountains and towns and spruce forests and icy streams and secluded coves and great expanses of snow broken only by animal tracks, the earth strained and groaned and shook. And in untold hundreds of places it cracked open, and in scores of places it buckled and toppled buildings and swayed trees and poles and wild dizzy arcs, and heaved up pavement, and snapped bridges, and sheared avalanches of snow and dirt and stone from mountain tops. Out in the sea, it raised a mighty wave. In Anchorage, Joan Groom's house quivered, then shook with increasing force. The chimney crashed onto the roof, and the birthday cake smashed onto the floor. Screaming with fright, the children toppled over in their chairs. Joan Groom lost her balance and pitched to the floor in a litter of flying books and glass and overturned furniture. Again and again the house shook, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, and then suddenly it ended. Somehow no one was injured. White with terror, Joan Groom began to sing a song the children had memorized. Slowly, one by one, they stopped crying and began singing, "The little bookshelf is wiggling itself and the books are falling down. The fairy tales and fables are tumbling over chairs and tables. Mother Goose is running loose. She is marching into town." At the Highland Fling, Harry Groom felt the first tremor and smiled. "Oh," he said flippantly, "another earthquake." Others at the bar smiled. After many years of gentle tremors and no real quake, Alaskans had come to regard the subject with nonchalance. But this tremor refused to stop, and the bar fell quiet. And then the whole room rocked with new force. Bottles pitched to the floor, glasses smashed, women screamed. People tried to rush to the door, but the floor was billowing like insane jello, and they fell, and they crawled. Harry Groom finally made it to the street, still holding, for no reason he remembered, the 2-for-1 glasses unbroken. Like husbands everywhere in town, he was trying to get home to his family. Outside on 4th Avenue, the pavement was billowing and people were falling and cars were bouncing, and one whole block of stores on 4th Avenue sank, just simply sank 20 feet into a huge crack of the convulsed earth. The marquee of the Denali movie theater, which was to open in a half hour for the evening show, sank to the level of the sidewalk. A block away, the 5-story J.C. Penney building swayed out over the street, swayed back, and then one end sank in a roar of crumbling masonry and glass. Elsewhere, a new 6-story apartment not yet occupied collapsed in thunder, and in many places, earth fissures snaked right through living rooms. At the 14-story Mount McKinley apartment, one of Anchorage's 2 tallest buildings, Delphine Haley was riding the elevator near the 8th floor. I know her father, Andy Haley, a Washington, D.C. attorney. The elevator quivered and stopped, and then it began bouncing up and down, and Delphine Haley screamed in terror. The whole world, it seemed to her, was screaming. The elevator stopped bouncing momentarily between floors, and she squeezed through a 14-inch opening in the doors and climbed to the floor above. She made her way to the stairwell, and in the darkness, in the incredible shaking and swaying, she became hysterical. Crying, she pitched herself headlong down each flight, crawled across the landing, and pitching and crawling, finally made her way out to the ground floor and out. She looked back and saw others crawling groggily out of the building. Up the entire face of the structure, the apartment was scarred by a series of zigzagging cracks. When Esther McCready's ham pitched from the stove, she knew it was no ordinary tremor, and she hurried out. Near the door, she was thrown down by a violent new shudder, and just outside the door, she turned and watched her home sink as if in slow motion up to the roof level in a huge crevasse. Beyond, where 100 homes had stood, she saw an eerie expanse of ruin. The bluffs overlooking Cook Inlet had fallen away 200 yards inland, taking with it houses snapped in two and 3 pieces into deep gorges. The area looked like a vast brown sea of motionless waves, peaked with pieces of homes and snapped trees. Esther McCready wept. And suddenly it was over. Some say after 90 seconds, others after 5 full minutes. And now, all of Anchorage, it seems, was arrested in an unfamiliar, overwhelming, complete silence. And from far out in the agitated ocean came the wave rushing toward the shaken land. As the depth grew shallower, the wave grew higher. Where it hit the land in broad open areas, it looked like a broad, suddenly rising tide, where it had to pass through a narrow passage, as it did at Seward, 130 miles south of Anchorage. It gathered momentum and force and raced forward like a wall of water. On it rushed toward Seward, a town of 1,900, which in 8 days was to celebrate its selection as an all-American city because of its economic self-improvement. It was now 5:44 p.m., 8 minutes after the quake hit Seward, and a wall of water 40 feet high rushed through the narrow mountainous passage of Resurrection Bay. It smashed over the Newtown port, ripped boats loose from the dock, sent everything in its path tumbling forward, including a 60-ton locomotive, which ended up 6 blocks away. In seconds, it seemed, Seward was left a wasteland of destroyed houses and broken railroad cars, all looking like toys angrily smashed by a wanton child. The big fuel tanks near the dock tumbled in the onslaught, and oil spread across the waters. Suddenly, the water took off backwards, and a wave of flame rushed toward the head of the bay. Ahead of the flames, small boats raced for the shore, and many, riding the crest of the tidal waves, sailed over trees 30 feet high and ended up on a pasture on the inland side of the woods. In town, Doug McRae and his family, including a 3-week-old baby, climbed a garage roof and from there stepped across to a house roof. The wave hit, carrying off the garage and part of the house. The roof floated off with the McRaes still on it, and after about 15 minutes lodged against 4 tall trees. There the McRaes shivered for hours. They ripped open a hole in the roof, tore out insulation, and wrapped themselves in it. The moon was now out, and they could see dogs floating by and saw their own car tumble past. To them, it seemed that the whole town was afire. Finally, the water and fire receded, and the McRaes were rescued without serious injury. Far to the southwest on Kodiak Island, the quake shook Louis Beatty's ranch house, but he and his clairvoyant cattle were safe on high ground. At the narrow head of Shearwater Bay, the great quake opened long fissures. The bay rushed in, the ground snapped shut, and towering geysers shot skyward. At the town of Kodiak, the quake was less spectacular. It shook houses, tumbled dishes, but somehow Father Bullock's cross clung to the wall. Up in the hills, a later inspection of tracks showed the quake shook many Kodiak brown bears out of their winter hibernation 2 weeks early and sent them in huge jumps down toward the shore. For at least 2 weeks now, they must wander without normal food supplies. Out in the harbor, skipper Bill Cuthbert cursed. He was sure some drunken sailor had bumped into his boat. Cuthbert stormed out on deck and saw masts waving madly all over the bay. He realized at once it was an earthquake and turned on his radio to the emergency marine band. Few Alaskan seamen need to be told that quakes make waves. State Trooper Don Church, back in Kodiak, only a half hour after a 22-day tour of his district. The entire Aleutian chain, Don told me, where he knows every village and nomadic family, rushed to the police station to sound the alarm over the marine radio. Expect a tidal wave. Get to high ground. But Bill Cuthbert couldn't. He had a lame engine. With no choice, with his boat tied to the dock, he went to the galley and waited. The first wave came at 6:47 p.m., gently, a gradual swell, followed by a gradual ebb. It was now dark. and the townspeople who had scampered up the hill with flashlights now looked like fireflies. The second wave hit with a roar, and in an instant every piling, every anchor, every line, every pier snapped and broke, and the harbor became a dizzy whirlpool. Cuthbert dashed to the wheelhouse while his two crewmen clung to the rail. They heard a man in a small boat crying for help. They tried to throw him a line, but couldn't. They saw his small boat carried off crazily in a wild maelstrom of swirling boats and debris. Cuthbert waited for the next onslaught. It came 55 minutes later, with less force, but more height. Again, the heavy scow was whirled around and battered its way through buildings and came to rest upon a crushed store. The third wave, less violent still, refloated the scow, and Cuthbert then tied a line to a telephone pole. Through the night, just about every 55 minutes, the waves came in, weaker each time, until the nightmare ended at 3 a.m. My friend, Trooper Don Church, still at his radio, was trying to contact each of the tiny remote villages on the island. In days to come, he would visit each personally. Some of them show on maps. Others, only in the trooper's notebook. How are the Munsons? Church would fly out to sea. The Martins? All 5 of them were missing. No trace of their cattle ranch. Village by village, family by family, he would count them all. But on this Good Friday night, there were 2 villages he could not reach by radio, Afognak and Uzinki. He dispatched fishing boats to both places, and then he began contacting fishing boats. Most replied. Others didn't. Ominously. The Salif did. Salif, where are you? Well, it looks, answered Cuthbert, as though I'm in the back of the Kodiak schoolhouse, 5 blocks from the shoreline. Because of Church's radio warnings, most of the people in the village escaped. A few are still missing. But in at least 4 cases, Afognak, Uzinki, Kogiak, and Old Harbor, the destruction was almost complete. Only a handful of houses remained. Timbers of others slapped at the shore, and other houses still intact were driven miles across the water to distant beaches. And now suddenly it was over. The sea became again serene. The roar of the wall of water and tumbling houses and boats was gone. Throughout the broad earthquake area, Alaskans began picking up the debris in search of bodies. By this week's end, the total of known dead and presumed dead is 129. The figure is astonishingly low. Why? Some explain it in terms of Alaska's sparse population, small towns, broad streets, low buildings. Others found the answer on their knees.
Engineers and the State Highway Department is surveying the badly needed surface connections to Seward. At this time, we have no accurate assessment of when the work will be completed, but there is no question that the railroad and the highway will be rebuilt as quickly as possible. I want to say also that the highway between Seward and the rest of the Kenai Peninsula has been surveyed. The State Highway Department estimates that this route can be opened within a few weeks. The road from Valdez to Fairbanks, Valdez to Anchorage is open and is ready and functioning to carry all normal traffic. Special federal programs exist for the reconstruction of highways damaged by disaster. In certain areas, such as the federal forests, the federal government will finance the entire cost. In other areas, disaster funds are available on a matching basis. At present, this ratio is 50-50. State and federal officials are hopeful that in Alaska's case, the matching requirement may be lightened. because of the unprecedented area-wide disaster that has fallen upon us. This program also provides funds for city streets and most roads not on the integrated road system. Equally important are the programs to aid those who have lost or whose homes, businesses, fishing vessels, and so forth have been severely damaged. Working with the Office of Emergency Planning and other federal agencies, our congressional delegation intends to ask for special legislation to ease the financial burden on all individuals affected. This legislation will be designed to specifically assist individuals who have lost so much in this overall disaster. To this point, I've spoken about federal assistance because clearly this can be the only immediate source of the massive amount of funds that is needed to patch together our stricken communities. But the road work that will take place will only make the roads passable, not permanently usable to former standards, under some of the provisions of Public Law 875. Money for private rebuilding will not in most cases be outright grants. I want to say here, though, that the special legislation that we hope and pray will be considered favorably by the United States Congress would permit all of the road work to be on a permanent reconstruction basis. While the federal government can and has come to our aid in a manner all of us can be grateful, much of the job of rebuilding Alaska will be ours and ours alone. We are grateful of the concern of the President of the United States and of our congressional delegation, the governors of all the states, and so many, many others. All of the shipping interests on the West Coast have approached us and are standing by to be helpful in any way possible. Labor and the contractors here in Alaska have all taken the same approach. They've all pitched in and have been working with us during the course of many meetings we've had with federal officials, with representatives of the military establishment, including the Corps of Engineers, the overall list of those who have offered their services, scheduled airlines, as well as the National Guard units from many of the other states of our American Union is just so long. That list is so long that it would be impossible for me to recall all of the messages or the different groups who are doing so much. Here in Anchorage, the service organizations such as the American Legion, the Salvation Army, and others have provided a service that none of us will ever forget. Our State Division of Civil Defense has been working around the clock coordinating activities. Special commendation in this regard is owing from all citizens to the Anchorage City Civil Defense Organization and to Mayor Chirac and his entire city administration. But the same story can be told about the effective civil defense efforts that I saw firsthand in my visits to Seward, Valdez, Kodiak, Kenai, Soldotna, and Homer. I want to say, too, that the mayors and other civic-minded officials and citizens of all of these other towns and the villages, too, of Valdez and Seward, Cordova, Kodiak, and the villages on Kodiak Island and elsewhere have done a magnificent job in trying to recoup, get going on a recouping from the tragedy within 24 hours of the time that disaster had struck them. We are indebted to the defense establishment in Alaska under the command of Lieutenant General Raymond Reeves. His commanders, Major General James Jensen, Major General Ned Moore, Rear Admiral Joseph Riera, Brigadier General Andrew Lipscomb, and every other officer and non-commissioned officer and enlisted man of their command. They have performed an outstanding service for Alaska since the moment disaster struck last Friday evening. The Alaska National Guard and Air Guard, under the command of Major General Thomas P. Carroll, has performed magnificently during this emergency. Rear Admiral George Sinai commander of the U.S. Coast Guard in Alaska, has had his organization working closely with us since the moment the disaster was first reported. So many have pitched in to help. As I said before, too many to name. The men and women of the Anchorage radio stations and all others of the news media who have done as much from the very beginning. I want to say that literally thousands of wires and phone calls have been received from people in all of the states and around the world wanting to help. Business organizations, large and small, have made overwhelmingly generous offers of assistance. The outpouring of sentiment from across this great land of ours has been, I believe, unprecedented in the history of our nation. We have received many messages and offers, but now I would like to give a message to all Americans from all Alaskans. We are grateful for your concern and sympathy. More than words can say, we are grateful for your offers of assistance. And we Alaskans intend to show all America that we can endure disaster no matter how devastating and come back. Many have said that it is nothing short of a miracle that the casualties were not far, far greater. I can think of no finer tribute to those who are gone, many of whom I knew personally and will always deeply miss. I can think of no finer memorial than to work what some would call another miracle, a miracle of will and energy and faith that will make this great land of ours better than the one we knew before. From what I have seen accomplished during the past 75 hours, I have no doubt that we will succeed. No man could ever have had more pride than I do tonight at being governor of this great state. Thank you very much.
You have listened to remarks by Honorable Governor William A. Egan, Governor of the State of Alaska.
Turning in homes, that was a complete loss as it slid down the hill. It was difficult to figure out how big a house it was or even what style after it was all through. There were two side-by-side that got it completely. Here they were dropping stuff out the windows as they were trying to get the house cleared up. Turning in is a completely restricted area. It's very difficult to get in. They gave special stickers out to people in that area in order to go in and get their belongings to move somewhere else. And these are some of them. This is the front of the house with the windows staring vacantly at the sky at about a 45-degree angle. Time ran short. We wanted to get more film in Turnagain, and we were called back to the airport at 4. We barely made the flight as it was. Here's another one that's tipped way over a long way out. It's going to be difficult even to get into these buildings to attempt to get the personal belongings out. And as you heard from the lists that were broadcast on KENI-KFQD, the missing people, most of them are from the Turnagain area. More belongings being brought out and put in pickup trucks and cars, panel trucks, anything they can get their hands on there. Everything topsy-turvy. This is the crevasse there, near those houses you just saw. It's about 20 feet deep. And in a sense, there's a street sign down in the whole Turnagain Parkway. In a sense, it extends all the way to the inlet there. Now, these shots were taken just before departure at International. There's what's left of the tower, the sloping pile of rubble on top of Anchorage International Airport. One man was killed there. There were no serviceable boats down there at all. The one we saw in reasonably good condition was high and dry and had holes stove in the hull. It probably wouldn't even be repaired. Dense black smoke from the oil tank. And from the air, although the camera didn't pick it up, we could see the flames looking at the inside of the tank, probably jumping some 10 or 15 feet. Residential area here of Valdez, some water still in the streets. And another tank farm, the Standard Oil farm, there were tanks toppled, some leaking, but they did not catch fire. Now, this is where the breakwater in the small boat harbor used to be, completely gone. Now you can see the flames in the tank. In fact, 15 or 20 feet was an underestimation. They looked like 40 or 50 feet in the air. This is right down in the dock area. It started getting a little bumpy there. Formerly there were buildings along here and, of course, many boats. Gilson's, again an example of concrete blocks coming apart. As the earthquake hit in Valdez, Alaska. Valdez and Anchorage, that there were only about 40 men working there, plus the military. The women and children haven't come back yet, and probably won't for several days. The Alaskan Hotel in Valdez, completely demolished. It not only sunk into the ground, but the complete second floor fell off, second floor front. Not too much left of it. As far as we could determine in Valdez, no one was hurt or injured in town. It all happened down in the dock area, unloading there. When the earthquake hit, the dock collapsed and they had surges of water up and down. Here are the military guards, downtown Valdez, by the Alaska Department of Highways. Trees swept up the street. Water came up 7 feet high here. The windows were underwater in that house. That was Governor Egan's house there when he used to live in Valdez. Telephone poles at a grotesque angle. And a boat there that was washed in. It looks in fairly good condition, but when you'd walk up to them, you'd see the hull completely stove in. A lot of ice, too, from Prince William Sound. You see it here on the trunk. One of the landmarks of Valdez, the Pinzon Bar, from the early days of Alaska. Out of business temporarily. Operations headquarters there in Valdez. The mayor and several officials from the city working along with the military. It has to be built. Seward, Cordova, Kodiak, Valdez, Anchorage. Here's one of the crevasses on one of the main streets downtown Valdez. As you can see, they're about 2 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet deep. The animals in Valdez that were left behind when the master had to leave with what few household belongings they could get, they were worried, of course, about tidal waves at the head of Valdez Arm there. They were worried that more tidal waves would come in. This cat looked particularly frightened yet, especially when it got to that crevasse. Definitely the, as far as we know, highest death toll in any of the Alaskan cities, with a population estimated around 800 or 900 in Valdez. The Army using the Valdez fire station, as the latter was the case, and we were able to go down to the waterfront for these pictures. This now is about 2 blocks inland. The Valdez Dock Company, another grotesque angle for a building, which you normally associate as being plumb and square. There don't seem to be many buildings like that left in Alaska, except here in Fairbanks. A car that happened to be parked where a crevasse opened up, dropping the front wheels into it. This was one of the fires that did hit the Valdez area. The entire town didn't burn up, as some of the early reports had, but they did have a serious and hot fire, but it was confined to a rather small area, probably 75 yards square. Those vehicles you see there have been burned entirely. They're completely gone. Here they're unloading the debris from a flatbed. It had been swept up by the tide. And a car deposited high and dry on another pile of rubble, which is steaming yet a little bit. More problems there in Valdez. A truck that was swept over there also. Tons of timbers were washed in, partly from some of the flotsam around the harbor, and also from buildings that had collapsed. Out of the fishing fleet in Valdez, there wasn't enough lumber, good lumber, to make a good-sized hatch cover. One of the trucks that was down there, loading at the dock, that one emerged also unscathed. The tractor itself, the flatbed, had some damage to it. And another pet in Valdez surveying the situation. This now is the main disaster area in Valdez, as the earthquake hit there, washing out the dock and sweeping away the buildings, cars, and people. This was a warehouse that was on the dock area, completely sunk into the bay now, with boxes broken and strewn out. This is the roof of the Marine.
His subject will be on the situation that prevails as a result of the great earthquake of 1964. We hope and trust that our public officials and all those responsible for the rebuilding of Anchorage will roll up their sleeves and in good heart and with much zeal and with proper upright understanding of their motives will undertake to make of Anchorage, Alaska, and for that matter for the other Alaskan cities, something that future generations will truly appreciate.
Concerned in representing the President all the aspects of the disaster. That involves everything relating to public facilities, public utilities, as well as the people. But we work very closely with the Office of Emergency Planning, and as a generalization, and I hope it is taken as a generalization, the Office of Emergency Planning is concerned mainly with the political subdivision as an entity. Its public facilities, its warehouses, its public buildings, its utilities, and so forth. The American Red Cross, on the other hand, is concerned with families as individuals and their rehabilitation. And the two programs have not only a close relationship, they're very closely dovetailed.
And what support will you in turn now get from your local Red Cross office, and what will they be doing specifically?
Well, actually, the local Red Cross office and the national office are melded into one. We're already set up in the Anchorage area in the YMCA building. The teams are getting ready now to go out to Cordova, Seward, Kodiak, Valdez, and the other affected areas. So it will be a basic operation, and we're not concerned at the moment about any fund campaign, if I heard you mention that, because we do have money set aside in our national budget for disaster, and we're already in operation. We operate before we even are concerned with a budget at the moment.
Well, specifically, who are you in a position to help now with grants?
Basically, well, there are two phases to the program, Sergeant. One is the emergency phase, in which it's a matter of basic necessities of life for anybody who needs them. Very shortly, we'll be going into a rehabilitation program, and I think this is very important to understand. I'm not going into the technical details, but fundamentally, it means helping families get back on their feet to a normal status of living when they don't have the resources to do it themselves, or they lack a portion of the resources. And this involves helping them with repair of homes, with damaged furniture, possibly medical bills, anything that you would think of in that line. It is, as you mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned it, a grant program. There are no loans involved because anyone who can afford to borrow could go to the Small Business Administration in the disaster program and get money on a loan.
Mr. Gordon, we're broadcasting not only to the Anchorage area, but throughout the state. Are there any general tips that you can give these people now?
The only tip I can say is that I'd like to assure all those who have suffered some damage that the American Red Cross is on the scene. We are prepared to do a job. There will be some difficulties, naturally, because the geography and the topography of this country here is much different than it is elsewhere in the United States. And I think that's the only tip that I have, Sergeant Munson.
Mr. Gordon, I'd like to review once again just where your teams are headed when you expect them to arrive there. These are for the locations outside of Anchorage.
At the moment, from all the information we can gather, these are the points. Kodiak, Seward, Valdez, and Cordova. Yes, those are the 4 basic points from which we'll work.
Well, Mr. Gordon, thank you very much for visiting with us here at the AFRN studios. We thank you for the information that you've brought to us and to the people along our network.
Thank you very much, Sergeant. I appreciated the opportunity of being with you today.
This is Air Force Sergeant Walter Munson reporting from the AFRN Network Headquarters.
Okay, fine. From Elmendorf, a program in connection with the broadcast we are involved in and have been involved in and will continue to be, I guess, for quite a long time, because there are still a lot of emergency operations going on. We were asked just a couple of minutes ago to repeat that it is urgent, that there is no official vaccination location at this moment. None of these locations we've been giving you for the morning are open and in operation right now. They're all closed. It is not possible to have any vaccinations at the moment. They are all closed. So you'll have to hang on just a little while. As soon as they get these restored, we'll let you know on that. It's important right now that you don't start out for the vaccination centers because they are not in operation right now.
Merrill, here's a report from Homer that we just received at KFQD, and you might want to read it.
Yeah.
Has to do with the situation there.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Bob. Avery Sewell, the manager of the small boat harbor, says there's about 80% loss of the small boat harbor in Homer. One retaining wall and corner is still standing. Piling is tipped this way and that. All will have to be pulled and dredged and reset, he says. The end of the Homer spit has dropped about 3 feet. Earl Hillstrand's big place down there, Land's End, is in the water at high tide. Large dock facilities are all right, and there's a tanker unloading there right now. There is some business damage and homes damaged. There have been no reported injuries, however, in the Homer area. Tidal action on the spit at the time of the quake was caused some water damage to canneries in the freezing plant, so they are out of order at the moment. Seldovia lost the retaining walls and had damage, but there's no report out of Seldovia of anything major as far as they know in Homer. That's a report given to us from Avery Sewell, who's manager of the small boat harbor down in Homer, and that's good news to get. At least we find out what's going on down there. Now, Frank, how about this announcement?
The Central Business District, you must remember, is a guarded area. However, arrangements have been made to allow business property owners and business proprietors and their helpers to their buildings today to remove valuables and essential stock. Now, this is being done today, but will cease at 7 p.m. The schedule for tomorrow will be announced later. Businesses and helpers are required to enter the Central Business District from the police checkpoint at the Roosevelt Hotel at 6th and H. Bring personal identification and some evidence relating you to the business place you want to go to. Come with a truck or other suitable vehicle for carrying away property, and keep in mind that no children are allowed. No one is allowed to enter any public building. I'm a little confused here, Merrill, on what this is.
This is any building with the red sign because it's a condemnation sign.
I see. Now, this plan is for businesses only, and these people must check in at 6th and H beginning at, let's see, this was 2 o'clock this afternoon. They must check in at 6th and H and bring identification and evidence that you are the owner or proprietor of the building you're heading for.
Right, and we have a raft of personal announcements which we're going to get to, and we want to get to them. We're not putting them off on purpose. Well, I mean, we're not putting them off because we want to. We're putting them off on purpose because there are other announcements that just take priority. The Red Cross is recruiting registered nurses. They need them now at Providence Hospital and at the typhoid immunization centers, and even nurses who have not been on active duty are needed. and will be accepted for various nursing assignments. So all registered nurses interested in helping are urged to check in. Don't call. Just check in at the Red Cross Disaster Headquarters at the YMCA building at 6th and F in Anchorage. If you are worried about getting through the by the Sentry on 9th Avenue, tell them what your mission is, and they'll allow you through there. Frank, there's a meeting at 3, and these are the people involved. Maybe you could run down that, because some of those people, I think, may not have been notified.
Right. The Anchorage Reconstruction Commission, which was appointed today, will be meeting at 3 o'clock. And here are the names of the committee members. And if you happen to know one of these committee members and might think that he did not hear this announcement, would you please notify them? Elmer Rasmussen, Richard Kennard, Dan Cuddy, Ron Rettig, Gordon Hartlieb, Robert McFarland, Carl Brady, Brad Phillips, Joe Josephson, Cliff Grow, Chat Chatterton, Don Hill, Norm Schwab, John Manley, and Augie Reitz. Now, there are some additional names here of the staff assistants: Elmer Gagnon, Tal Elliott, John Nichols, and Jack Shoup. The above-named people are to meet in the upstairs office of the fire department in the public safety building, and only these people and the press will be allowed to attend. The meeting is at 3 o'clock this afternoon, today.
Also, we want to keep repeating this because apparently people are showing up in large numbers at these vaccination points, and those that are already there we can't help, but those that are about to start out, if you missed the announcement before, these vaccination centers are now closed. They cannot give vaccinations at the moment, but they're in the process of replenishing the supply of serum, and as soon as that's accomplished, Civil Defense Headquarters will notify us here. We have direct radio contact all the time, and as we are in contact with the other agencies as well, and they will let us know, and we'll get it to you just as fast as that is open. If any laundries or cleaners are to be open or can open so people can get their clothes done, especially baby diapers and so on, call us here at KFQD if you would, and as soon as you can. Now,
would you want any of these personal messages to go out now?
Well, we might as well. I think that one is a good one. He has some special things there.
Now, Mrs. Thornton at Broadway 83842. That's Mrs. Thornton at Broadway 83842 has messages from the States for the following people. If you happen to hear one of these messages, if you happen to hear these names of anyone you happen to know, please notify them to call Mrs. Thornton at Broadway 83842 because she has messages from the States for these people. Mr. R.R. Robinson, the director of the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management at Anchorage. Mr. R.R. Robinson, Red Cross Field Director at Elmendorf. There's a message also for the Red Cross Field Director at Elmendorf. Glenn King, Lois Suggett, R. Isnes, I-S-N-E-S, Earl P. Ellis, Dan Olson, Danny Olson, Stanley Rotrep, R-O-T-T-R-E-P, Stanley...
That's U-P, actually. She just spelled it phonetically. Rotrep, Stan Rotrep.
R-U-T-T-R-E-P, Stanley Rotrep, John Morgan, George and Laura Wendell, Eckenberg family, and Helen Vick. And those messages are being held by Mrs. Thornton at Broadway 83842.
And Darrell Wanacott of the Salvation Army at 8th and C requests any assistance possible in the procurement of bread. They badly need bread for sandwiches. So if Ed Walden and any of his boys are listening in, they need some bread at the Salvation Army at 8th and C, and they need it as fast as they can get it down there. Here's one, Frank.
Frank D. Pietro of Diamond 41517 has space available for a couple with 1 or 2 children near Abbott Loop School. Frank D. Pietro at Diamond 41517 has space available for a couple with 1 or 2 children near Abbott Loop School.
Okay, now, Frank, just a little bit ago, we got the latest that is being sent out on the Associated Press wire to the states, and I wonder if you would take us through that. It's about 2:45, and we should tell them, I think, that this is KFQD in Anchorage, Alaska, 10,000 watts. We're the Civil Defense Emergency Base Station here, and we're taking personal messages, which we'll get around to just as fast as we can. We also have all of the other emergency messages that are coming through, and we'll pass them along as they come to us and in the importance they appear.
This is a message from Saul Pett of the Associated Press. On this grim gray Easter Sunday, Alaska's biggest city looked today as if it had been shaken and clawed by monster hands. Long, jagged cracks, some 20 feet wide, some only hairlines, in Anchorage pavements and streets, and looking like zigzagging lines of black lightning, shattered the Anchorage area. Many buildings and private homes lay in dismal ruin, some in holes where there had been no holes before. Others heaved up onto ridges where there had been no ridges before. Masonry, steel, wood, telephone poles, and cars lay in a cataclysmic heap where they were left Friday night by the most violent earthquake to hit America since San Francisco in 1906. The relatively few casualties do not reflect the extent of the damage or the intensity of the earth tremor. Half the city, it is estimated, felt the wrath of the disaster in buildings completely or partially destroyed, in loss of water, heat, and electrical power. Other buildings show new cracks hourly as they settle deeper into the earth. Fire damage so far has been relatively small, but fire remains a constant hazard with the city's water pressure almost non-existent. Anchorage's 2 tallest buildings, each 14 stories tall, are scarred by frightening cracks. They were evacuated of people and remain unsafe for use. Much of the downtown area is in ruins. Rescue workers still search for bodies in the 5-story J.C. Penney building, which swayed out over 5th Avenue Friday night, swayed back, and then sank into the convulsed earth at one end. Many residents were doubling and tripling up in homes which are still safe. Many lined up with buckets for drinking water from mobile Army tanks and to use field toilet facilities. The city's 4 radio stations remained on emergency basis, broadcasting reports all over town. The people were comparing notes, and then the grim discovery that few of them in business places or private homes had earthquake insurance. In Anchorage alone, the damage already has been estimated at $250 million and is likely to go higher. The Turnagain area, a section of 30 to 50,000 and more homes, hugging the shore of the Cook Inlet area, was the hardest hit of all of the residential districts. Homes were rocked and swayed and fell like dominoes. Entire houses lay buried in deep new gorges. Some were ripped in two, and 2 or 3 were completely separated in slices. One kitchen wing ended up 30 feet away from the rest of the house. Homes, trees, telephone poles leaned dizzily in all directions. And on this Easter Sunday, some of the residents trickled back to their demolished homes, saving what could be saved, clothing, furniture, and radios. And it was a pitiful sight indeed, and little could be saved. Some of the homes are still too dangerous to enter, and consequently many of them will not be able to be entered, and therefore the people stand to lose what was in the home. A great many of these people will still be needing places to live and the kind of kindness that will help them rehabilitate their lives and help their families to hold together and rebuild. This kind of help of course, is the kind of help we're getting now in Anchorage. Announcements are coming in every moment with homes being offered to help these people pull themselves together. It's another mark of the humanitarian qualities of the people of Anchorage. Merrill, do you have another announcement?